Good morning. I'm here today with Alasdair Houston, who is well known for his Gretna House Charolais herd. Welcome to the conversation, Alasdair.
Good
Um,
morning, Sarah.
Perhaps you could start by telling us a little bit about the farm you've got up there on the Scottish borders.
Yes, by all means, we have two units, Gretna House Farms, which is home unit across in Dumfriesshire on the west side of the country. We're about 800 acres here of mixed arable and livestock. At the moment, most of the farm is sown down to grass, and the key in-hand enterprise here is the pedigree cattle enterprise. And across in Berwickshire, we have about 450 acres over there of quite a high quality arable and vegetable unit, which I farm with a great friend under a contract farming agreement. So he does all of the work, and it's very easy for me to manage from a distance.
And if we talk about your Charolais cattle, tell us a little bit about those.
Yeah, we've built the herd up to around about 60, 65 cows plus all followers. That's probably about the number we'll keep them at the moment. Buildings would start to become a restraint. We have a herd of another breed as well. We're here to talk about Charolais, so I shan't mention any other breed. So we're about 100 head of cows plus recipients, because we're still committed to the sadomasochism of an embryo transfer program, which we still do every year. So the herd is numbering around 60. We've tried to really focus down on a few proven genetically predictable lines to give us that predictability of performance generation after generation.
Now, I mean, obviously, some people will know the term Gretna Green. I gather you've got a big interest in Gretna Green itself, known perhaps for, I'm going to say, shotgun weddings in the past. How have you coped with all of that during COVID?
Yeah, this has been a very, very challenging year. I mean, challenging is about the most mild word I could probably use. It's been a dog of a year. So we were locked down, as the rest of the country was, on the 23rd of March last year. Went into the pandemic with 300 or so colleagues, many of whom have been with me for many, many years. 3 hotels, a visitor attraction welcoming about 900,000 visitors a year, an online business welcoming around about and at Gretna Green, because of its heritage of weddings, as you mentioned, we built the business into hosting around 10% of all of the weddings in Scotland. So we would normally be welcoming around 3,000 weddings a year as well. So suddenly the world all came to a standstill at the same time, didn't it? And we've not been immune from that. So it's been very difficult. We've had to make about half the team redundant. We're starting next week to think about patchily reopening, and it'll be a long, slow climb into anything like getting the full business back operating. But in the same way as we might be coming to talk about a different virus hit us 20 years ago on the cattle, we will build back the Gretna Green business, and we have great plans to build it back better.
Well, that's good to hear, I'm sure, for everybody who enjoys coming to visit you, Alasdair. Now, I think this week is somewhat of a bittersweet memory for you, which we just touched on there. I gather that it was 20 years ago this week that you lost your entire herd due to a foot and mouth outbreak. Talk me a little bit through that.
Yeah, you're absolutely right. It's actually last week now. I remember the date so clearly. It's 16th of March 2001. And undoubtedly, that up to that point, it felt like one of the worst periods and one of the worst days in my life. And I quite unashamedly say that. On that date, we had every head of livestock killed out. We're rather mysteriously, we are on a list of being an IP in infected premises, but you could have had an open day the night before that we were killed out. So we had no visible symptoms in any of our cattle of foot and mouth. And it just felt absolutely awful. Walking around the cattle sheds the night before I knew the slaughter team were arriving. And I do not mind admitting for 1 second that I wept like a baby. Just felt that I'd let them down, and it was poor. So we were killed out 100% on that date. and it felt like a really, really dark day. It was a dark day, and it was dark weeks and dark months afterwards. But again, as with many things in life, you have to ask yourself some pretty deep questions about what you do next. And choices are choices, and one choice is to curl up in a ball and feel sorry for yourself, and the alternative choice is not to do so. And I was absolutely determined that it would be the latter, and that we would build back, and we would try and build back better. So off we went, and that started the next journey.
And I think all you had left at that point was a few Charolais embryos in your flask, because you were already using an embryo transfer system. What kept you going through this? I think, we've all been through tough periods this year, but nothing like that. And I know I was involved at the time with reporting on the foot and mouth, and how upset farmers were, and people just didn't see how this devastated their business.
That's right. It did devastate business, didn't it? But I think also the general public perhaps didn't realise on an emotional level quite how attached farmers, the farming community, are to their livestock. I think there is still this perception, isn't it, that farmers farm animals only for profit. Well, yes, profit kind of has to happen to keep a farming business sustainable, but most farmers I know care very much about their livestock. So in terms of how did one keep going? Well, I was just absolutely determined that this was not going to beat us. We had our own story, but we were far from alone. Much of the industry was going through exactly what I was going through. My stockman, John, who's still with me, he was going through. But I was absolutely determined that we would be resilient. I was absolutely determined that we would get back into the breed that I loved so much, which my father had actually been one of the relatively early, I think, second importation pioneer importers of. So resilience, you have to dig deep, you have to be resilient. You cliche, you pick yourself up and you dust yourself down and make choices. And my choice was that I would, yes, get back into production as soon as I could with the embryos that we had in storage from our pre-foot and mouth herd, from families that were doing very well for us then. And then I was, as my wife would say, I became something a little bit obsessed and like a bloodhound. And before the wonderful days of online pedigree trees and everything else, I was like somebody not quite right, with great big bits of paper all over the floor, and I would recreate family trees with genetics that I had admired in other people's herds, and I would color cluster them up for bull sales in one color, and color cluster them up with females that I'd admired in another color, and I would have these family trees all over the house, not quite all over the house, but all over certain rooms in the house, and I would identify clusters in families that were then attracting me, and then I was like a bloodhound, and I went out into these herds and sought to try and buy females from these particular family lines. So that's what I did. That was my approach.
And I think today, you're very well known within the Charolais family, if you like, for producing top breeding bulls. How important are EBVs today, and why?
Well, I think EBVs I always see as it's part of the mix. We've got knowledge of pedigrees is incredibly important. Visual assessment is very, very, very important. The stockman's eye is still very, very important. EBVs are important because there are certain things that you cannot see with the stockman's eye. I would use one example of that, perhaps the most obvious example. Is you're a better man than me, Gungadin, if you can tell the gestation length of an animal by visual assessment, for example. So EBVs, the science behind EBVs is there. It is at base, it is a simple system, and if the data going in is accurate, the data coming out will give you an indication of a predictability of performance. Not with certainty, we all know that. Not perfect, we all know that. But alongside knowledge of pedigree and visual assessment, EBVs, I believe, are an incredibly important tool to aid for selection in females and males and within your own herd. But at the same time, I would say that I think in anything in life, it's dangerous to be a fundamentalist on anything. And you wouldn't follow your sat nav over a cliff if you knew that the sat nav was taking you down a blind route. And there are occasions where you know that you are looking at an animal that's not right for you. And however good the EBVs on that animal are, that's the sat nav over the cliff scenario. So I think that EBVs should be used and respected and taken as a very, very, very important scientific tool, but don't abdicate your responsibility to EBVs altogether. But equally, in my opinion, those that say they have no role in progressive cattle breeding are plain wrong.
I think that's some very interesting points there, Alasdair. Now, how many breeding bulls do you aim to sell each year?
Yeah, I should count them out. We probably sell about the best part of 30 between embryo work and our pedigree cows and heifers. We're probably selling about 40 breeding bulls a year, 40 odd breeding bulls a year. So at Carlisle, Sterling, and privately, an increasing number privately. This year has been interesting, hasn't it? With COVID, we've all suddenly become amateur videographers and the wonders of social media and everything else. So the proportion of private sales to auction sales has increased this year, but about 40 bulls a year.
And have you found that change in the process of selling bulls has benefited you, or has it been more difficult to get the prices that you're more used to getting in the showroom?
That's an interesting question. When you know you've got a very good bull, it's very difficult to value him, actually, because if you've got a bull that you think's worth 10 or 15,000, you haven't a clue what he's worth, and the live auction is still undoubtedly the best way of realizing that value. The auction's a wonderful thing, isn't it? Because not only have you got generally people in the same shed space under the same roof looking at the same animal, but you've also got this wonderful thing called ego and competition that comes into play between these wonderful things called human beings. So some of that becomes a little bit less passionate, I think, when it's a pure online or an on-farm sales situation. You've got on an on-farm situation, you've got two men, a seller and a buyer. Can you agree by private treaty or not? So to answer your question, I think the mid-range to the top end of the commercial bull market, if you're experienced enough, and it's not always easy valuing your own stock, is it? But if you're experienced enough, I think that those values are being struck quite fairly and accurately on farm. I think the better bulls, it's quite difficult to value them on farm, and the auction is undoubtedly gives the edge. I mean, look at some of the examples of another breed in a heifer quite recently. I don't think that man would have had the audacity to ask £250,000 on farm for another breed heifer, for example. That can only happen at an auction. So the same applies. But COVID has undoubtedly brought some changes that will stay in the same way as foot and mouth did with trading livestock, for better or for worse. And I think the ability to use social media and private sales has been forced upon us. And I know this has implications at society level, of course, because of income from sales, but it has been forced upon us. And those that do have a brand and a following, if you're getting offered a full and fair price at home, it is quite difficult not to accept that.
Yes, of course. Now, I wonder, Alasdair, looking to the future of breeding pedigree cattle, how do you see this going? And when you're breeding your Charolais cattle, what traits are you looking for? How important is it to be in touch with the end market, with the consumer, basically?
Well, it's essential, isn't it? And if you look how the breed has changed over the last, let's just take the last 20 years, the bulls that we were producing and selling successfully 20 years ago, we quite rightly wouldn't be getting bids for today. So that tells its own story. If any breed or breeder is not prepared to modify what used to be their eyes' perfection in the light of changing market demands, then that breed or breeder will fall behind. That it's clear, isn't it, that the huge framed, harder to finish, grow onto any weight Charolais is not what the market wants now. In my own case, I have definitely moderated my cow frame size. I do not want to have a herd of small cows, but I have deliberately pulled 150 kilos or so out of a mature cow weight, and might come down a little bit more from that. What I'm trying to breed, and what I believe for the next few years, Charolais has an opportunity, definitely in relation to its fast growth rate, to tune into the ever increasing demand for carbon efficiency. These animals can be using less fixed resource for less time if they are farmed efficiently and on farm for less time. So I think that the breed has an opportunity to play in to this carbon footprint zeitgeist period that we're in now. And I think that that can be one of the top level marketing messages that we play. Now, at farmer level, what are we wanting? We're wanting undoubtedly to carry on with our progress in relation to calving ease. Nobody wants big dead calves in any breed. I ask people that are not using Charolais, why would you not use a Charolais today when you can see your pals taking more money from you at the store markets? Why are you not using a Charolais? Now, invariably, the answer that I get, if it's a no, is based on a perception of the breed from 15 or 20 years ago. They had fingers burned with some maybe coarser boned, harder to carve, longer gestation cattle that we were producing 15 or 20 years ago, because at that time, that's what the market was telling us to produce. So having refined calving ease, having refined gestation length, but still able to produce the fastest growing bull terminal sire in the UK, and then laying down this softer flesh, which again, the breed has modified, and which is what the finisher needs. It's what whether we like it or not, the supermarkets are still selling the bulk of the beef that is produced. The pack size needs. So we need moderate framed, softer fleshed, easy calved, short gestation animals with great balance and great style. That's what I would be trying to breed over the next 5 to 10 years of a breeding program.
I think that's great, Alasdair. So you really feel that the future for Charolais is bright?
Undoubtedly, absolutely, undoubtedly. But we do need to keep our marketing messages going strongly in relation to the progress that we have made, because a lapsed user, in my opinion, is lapsed because he's still building his perceptions based on the Charolais of 15 years ago, not the modern British Charolais, of which there are so many great strains out there now.
Thank you very much, Alasdair. Thanks for taking the time to talk to me this morning. And I hope everyone will find this very interesting. Thank you.
You're very welcome. Thank you very much indeed. Thank you.